Great. Hello, we start just right now, ladies and gentlemen, their followers. My name is David Lopez, and I'm a consultant for Latin America and lawyer assistant in Swiss law for the International Association of Human Rights. And this in the behalf of this organization and the East-West Bridge in Malaysia that we wish you all the best, and we give you the welcome in this side event entitled BRI and the SDGs Goals. It's in the behalf of these organizations and in the behalf of the East-West Bridge of Malaysia, as I mentioned before, that I welcome all those participants who follow us in this side event today. Before I begin, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, especially the East-West Bridge for the support, those who worked on the technical side of the event, the members of IDES, and the panelists who make up this event. I would mention the Professor Alfred de Zayas, the former UN independent expert of the United Nations from Geneva, the Dr. Mohammad Bagher Farouk, researcher fellow at the German Institute of the Global Area Studies from Germany, the Admiral Professor Hanayat Colombage, former secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka, the Dr. Hassan Daoud Butt, associate professor and former project director of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the Dr. Gustavo Dangai, member of the Latin American and Caribbean China News Network from Argentina, who also helped a lot in this in the convening and realization of this event, and the Dr. Eric Salheim, former Undersecretary of the UN and Executive Director of the UNIP. Without them, this event would not have been possible. It would also I would also like to thank the diplomatic mission present, friendly organizations of society, of civil society, and all those who follow us and watch the event either live on the IDES YouTube channel or in different mode by the same system. To start this event, I would like to give a brief introduction without going too much into details, and then follow our panelists to give their point of view on the topic addressed. The Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development was adopted in 2015 by the United Nations. They contain the most ambitious global agenda adopted by the international community to mobilize collective actions, common goals around the world. While they aim to fight extreme poverty, they integrate and balance three essential dimensions of sustainable development, such as economic, social, and environmental, providing a value roadmap to articulate global policies making. However, the complex architecture under which they have been designed, there are technical limitations and the well-founded criticisms of the international community place significant constraint of the novel agenda ability to achieve its intended goals of building a better planet for generations to come. In the midst of all of this, the project have been carried out so that the development of peoples in all areas can sum to fruition and respond to the holistic needs of the population, even responding to the criticism traditionally made of the implementation of the SDGs, which sometimes seems to be the rhetoric of the same if we refer to the MDGs and other development projects and plans that have been obstructed by the system and financial interests that have always governed the world in which we live. Thus, 2023 marks the 10th anniversary of the One Belt, One Road project and implementation that has had extremely positive results in the fields of social, economic, cultural, and political development. We could even say that this initiative of Chinese conception stopped the classic American version of globalization conceived in the 90s of the last century. It should be seen not only as an infrastructural and transport corridor, but also and above all as a context for the joint development of the countries involved in the project. We are undoubtedly talking here about development in the fields of transport, humanitarian cooperation, banking, and tourism. I don't want to go any longer in this brief introduction where all these issues will most probably be addressed. We will try to clear up any doubts by analyzing even criticism that have generally been made of the BRI from the West, bearing in mind that we are in a complex political, economic, social, and cultural situation all over the world. Without further ado, allow me to give the floor to the Professor Alfred de Zayas, who, due to these duties, will have to leave us during this event, but whom we thank enormously for his value and honorable presence. Dear Alfred, good afternoon, Geneva. You have the floor. Hello. Professor.
Thank you, David. I had not unmuted myself. As the case may be, I'll be speaking on the Belt and Road Initiative and Sustainable Development Goals. As everybody knows, I was the first independent expert on international order from 2012 to 2018, and I presented 14 reports to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, many of them dealing with issues very, very related to the BRI and to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I want to stress that there is a convergence in the goals and in the content of the Belt and Road Initiative and the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Beyond that, actually, I would say that BRI is very much in the spirit of the purposes and principles of the United Nations, which is to bring people together, inclusivity. The paramount principle of international order is, of course, peace. The United Nations Charter commits all states to promoting peace with justice. This is principle 1 of my 25 principles of international order, which I submitted to the Human Rights Council in my 2018 report and republished in chapter 2 of my book, Building a Just World Order. I have a human rights trilogy. Building a Just World Order was the first one in 2021, followed by this book, Challenging Mainstream Narratives, and the third in the trilogy is the Human Rights Industry, which is expected out in the month of May. In this context, I wish to recognize that peace can be served through the expansion of economic relations and enhanced commercial exchanges with other countries. This is what the BRI is committed to do in the 151 participant states, a win-win strategy. Trade is not war, but can be an effective strategy precisely to prevent wars. The more states are interrelated and interdependent, the less the temptation to break the beneficial links. What is dangerous for world peace is American-style predator competition, bullying, blackmailing, and threatening other states to force them to give up their own economic models and adopt the American neoliberal system that has led to so many bankruptcies, unemployment, and chaos. Of course, we are aware that the Western-led information war perceives the rise of China as a danger to Western economic hegemony and has turned its sights on the BRI, which it attempts to discredit through disinformation and fake news. The Western information war engages in fear-mongering and tries to engineer hate toward anything Chinese. This is tantamount to incitement to racial hatred and violence, both prohibited in Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and both of them incompatible with the letter and spirit of the UN Charter. Of course, there are issues to be discussed in the context of building infrastructures in 151 participating countries and financing projects through Chinese loans. Hitherto, the conditionalities of Chinese loans have been reasonable, and they would in any event be subject to modification where necessary. In any event, Chinese loans are not toxic, as many loans given to states by the US-led International Monetary Fund are. I wrote a report on that, my 2017 report to the General Assembly was entirely devoted to the abuses of the IMF in its conditionalities. For instance, the privatization of public enterprises, the reduction of public services, the dismissal of civil servants, all tantamount to massive interference in the internal affairs of states with negative impact on the exercise of the ontological obligations of states. What are the ontological obligations of every state? First and foremost, securing the peace and stability of society and addressing the welfare of all persons under its jurisdiction. This requires social legislation for the protection of the population and not prioritizing the welfare of foreign investors and transnational corporations. I also wrote a report to the General Assembly 2015 devoted to the abusive investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which is the so-called investment protection chapter in most free trade agreements and most bilateral investment treaties. My 2017 report confirms the findings of Naomi Klein. I suppose most of you are familiar with the Canadian author Naomi Klein, who wrote a best-selling book under the title The Shock Doctrine, and it is really an indictment against the abuses by the IMF in transforming people-friendly economies into neoliberal economies that benefit only an elite. So I wish to conclude very briefly by saying that my experience, what I have been reading thus far on the Belt and Road Initiative is positive, and I think that it has an enormous potential to assist governments in advancing with the achievement of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In any event, it does not share the approach of the predator IMF. I thank you. And if there are any questions, I am available.
Hello, David. David,
Thank you.
can you hear me, David? David, can you hear
Yes,
me?
please. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Yeah, I'm supposed to give a welcome speech and opening speech. Can I speak now?
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, okay.
Can I then absent myself?
Okay, okay. I think that's fine. Let's continue with the program according to the program, because I think there are not many questions. I think we can maybe later on we can reply them by email or what if they ever come up with any questions. Is it okay with you? Yeah, I think that should be okay. Okay, right. Okay, Mr. David Lopez, founder and president of the International Association for Human Rights and Social Development. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and good evening to everyone, depending where you are, and a very welcome to the BRI and UN Sustainable Goals webinar. This year is the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative launched by China in 2013. We are also at halfway mark on the timetable for the implementation of 2030 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN in 2015. According to UN Secretary General Mr. Guterres, the BRI is intrinsically linked to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The BRI will help accelerate the implementation of 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. It is therefore opportune time for us now to review and assess how the BRI could contribute and has contributed to the realization of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The BRI is a mega transnational development project with 140 participating countries, which together account for over half of the world's population. It aims to promote economic growth of partner countries through enhancing policy, infrastructure, trade, finance, and people-to-people connectivity. On the other hand, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all UN members in 2015, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. The agenda consists of 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. The SDGs are universal, transcends borders, and call for all countries to come together in a global partnership to end poverty and other deprivations, improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth while tackling climate change and working to preserve the world's oceans and forests. Although the BRI and UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development differ in nature and scope, they share a similar vision and a number of basic principles. The BRI is highly compatible with the 2030 Agenda in terms of vision, goals, and measure. It provides strong support and impetus for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Both initiatives recognize the importance of international cooperation and partnership to achieve their goals. Top on the list of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The World Bank estimates that the infrastructure investment of BRI could lift 7.6 million people worldwide out of extreme poverty and 32 million out of moderate poverty. This is of particular significance as the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed close to 100 million people worldwide into poverty. Besides social and economic development, environmental protection and climate change are also key issues under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So is the BRI. The vision and action statement on jointly building Belt and Road, published by China in 2015, emphasize that BRI is environmental friendly and should promote ecological progress in conducting investment and trade, increase cooperation in conserving eco-environment, protecting biodiversity, and tackling climate change. The BRI therefore integrates green development and ecological and environmental protection into every aspect of its development, with the principle of energy conservation and environmental protection. Green development was further underscored by President Xi Jinping at the opening speech of the second Belt and Road Forum held in 2019, that the Belt and Road aims to promote green development. We may launch green infrastructure projects, like make green investment and provide green financing to protect the earth, which we all call home. To summarize, both the Belt and Road Initiative and the UN 20 Agenda for Sustainable Development aim to promote economic development and sustainability, particularly in developing countries. While the BRI seeks to promote economic growth through policy coordination, infrastructure connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people bond, the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Agenda aims to achieve sustainable development through a comprehensive and integrated approach that addresses economic, social, and environmental issues. Today, we are honored to have a panel of hands-on experts from the UN, former government officials in charge of the implementation of BRI projects, senior think tankers, and academicians, who will share with us their thoughts and insights on the BRI and 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure we all will have a better grasp of how the BRI could and has complemented the implementation of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Agenda at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Cole. Thank you very much there, Professor Alfred, for the intervention. Sorry again to didn't mention you at the beginning. Their professor, representative of the East-West Bridge. I have at the same time control some technical problems that we have actually on the YouTube channel. The internet is not so fast, but in any case, we will place and install on the network and in the YouTube after the side event all the integrality of this important event. So right now I will give the floor to the Dr. Mohammad Farouk in Germany. Good afternoon, Professor.
Hello, thanks a lot for the invitation. I am Mohammad Farouk from the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, based in Hamburg generally, but today in Montreal, Canada. So for today, I decided to talk about the Middle East as a region that is deeply involved in the BRI, because when it comes to the BRI, it's hard, maybe it's or it's too easy to talk about it in general terms. So most of the time when you talk about it in general terms, it's either overly positive or overly negative. So instead of talking about the BRI in general, I'm going to talk about specific dimension of the BRI in the Middle East, because then we can talk with enough evidence and specific case studies to see if it actually helps or not. Potentially, theoretically, I would argue that the BRI and Sustainable Development Goals are potentially compatible. At least there's nothing inherently incompatible about this relationship. But again, usually the devil lies in the details, so it's important to talk about the specific cases. So I'm going to talk about the Middle East and how the issue of environment and economy or economic development intersect in this region with the BRI. So to begin with, we have to understand the contemporary situation of the region. There's the geopolitical situation, there's the geoeconomic situation, and then there's the environmental situation or aspect. Environmentally, the region is doing very badly, according to NASA research, the region, Middle East and North Africa, is experiencing its worst environmental crisis in the last 900 years. So basically, a very severe crisis environmentally. Also, economically, the region remains mostly underdeveloped, except for some specific cases. In terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics, the region has been kind of torn between its geopolitical dimension being associated with the US and geoeconomic dimension being associated with China, increasingly with China. So since 2011, when the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton State Department decided to pivot to Asia, one of the consequences of that was less attention paid to the Middle East and Europe. And quite ironically, with the US pivot to Asia, Middle Eastern countries are also started pivoting to Asia, but for economic reasons, for development reasons, not for geopolitical reasons. So basically, to summarize, the region is geopolitically oriented or engaged with the US and geoeconomically oriented towards China. So it has these two dimensions. And also in recent years, China has been emerging as a green superpower. So in several areas of renewable energies, China has been able to basically become either the #1 in the world, for instance, in terms of wind power production or solar power and so forth. In some areas of hydrogen, the industrial dimension of hydrogen as a carrier of energy, China has emerged as a global pioneer. In some areas, it is still behind the EU and the US. So basically, I'm going to talk about how the region is responding to the green rise of China. And of course, a lot of it is packaged or under the umbrella of the BRI. So in that sense, yes, the BRI is positive, but the way I look at the BRI is like an umbrella concept, and then you can do different types of projects under the category of the BRI. So these projects could be positive or could be negative depending on the context and the case study. That's why it's hard to talk about the BRI. So in terms of green energy, you can see that the region is basically very much dependent on carbohydrogen for its economic development. And in those countries that don't have hydrocarbon resources, the economic situation and the developmental index are not that high. So one part of the strategy of these governments, these specific governments, for instance, the Gulf Cooperation Council, with 6 countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and so forth, they have developed their own visions or developmental visions. So the Vision 2030 for Saudi Arabia is one specific vision. Emiratis, the UAE has its own Vision 2030. Oman has its Vision 2040. Kuwait has its Vision 2035. And all these visions are basically aligned, at least on paper, with the BRI. And the green energy cooperation or renewable energy cooperation is a big part of that vision, because the region has come to the conclusion that it is time to move beyond hydrocarbons and develop the region in terms of basically green energy and also developmentally in terms of infrastructure. And in that sense, there's like potentially perfect synergy between China, which has the overproduction problem, if you want to call it. It's not really a problem, or the luxury problem. And then the underdevelopment infrastructure, underdevelopment of the region. So in that sense, there's perfect synergy between the two regions. And the regional leaders are increasingly coming to that conclusion. And that includes also the green energy sector. For instance, I will go through some of these countries and how they are thinking about cooperation with China under the category of the BRI in the renewable energy sector and economic diversification. So the first one is Saudi Arabia in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Saudi Arabia has developed its own 2030 vision. And a huge part of that vision, at least theoretically speaking, is transforming the economy beyond its dependence on hydrocarbons. And one of the companies that has been involved in the production of green energy is Aqua Power, ACWA Power. And this is basically 49% owned by the China Silk Road Fund. So basically the Chinese own almost half of it, 49% of it, and the Saudis 51%. And this company has become more than a company. It has become some sort of platform for regional cooperation. So through this company, China is inserting itself very palpably, very strongly, I would say, in the region, in the green energy sector of the region, and becomes part and parcel of the regional desire or for transition towards a non-hydrocarbon-based economy. And Aqua Power has become this platform for cooperation. You can see a similar trend, deepening relations in the green sector between China and the UAE. There's an energy strategy 2050 from the UAE, and the vision behind this strategy is to produce at least 50% of energy as in terms of, I mean, with renewable energy, produce 50% of the needed power of the country. And for that, the Emiratis are increasingly getting basically to materialize that, they're increasingly deepening their relations with China. And they are also the host of the International Renewable Energy Association. So in that sense, China plays an active role over there. This is, there's a quote from one of the regional leaders that says, if you're in the business of renewable energy, you have to look to China. You cannot ignore China because China has established itself as a global superpower in the green sector. And then you have countries like Iran. So just like those 6 GCC countries had visions, Iran has basically a bilateral comprehensive strategic partnership with China, and they have signed a 25-year roadmap with China. A good part of that is also focused on moving beyond the traditional energy sources, fossil fuels, and diversifying the economy through hydropower, for instance, solar power, nuclear power, and so forth. So in terms of the Iranian ambition to go green as much as possible, again, there's perfect compatibility with what China can offer and what Iran desires. You can see that this economic or developmental issue is being negatively influenced by JCPOA or the failure to materialize JCPOA and the American withdrawal from this nuclear deal. So yeah, there are ways in which geopolitics has a negative effect on these developmental issues, and the two are interconnected. Then we have the case of Turkey. Turkey has a new policy called Asia Anew or Asia Again. So basically, after years of trying to be a member of the EU, to join the EU as an EU state, and the EU not welcoming that idea, Turkey has once more, with the rise of countries such as China and India, Turkey is reorienting itself once more towards the Asian side of its identity, its dual identity. And again, they are deepening their relations with China. They are developing their own middle corridor, which has arguably good synergy with the BRI in terms of the corridor that goes through Central Asia and Iran, and then there's the middle corridor, and then above there's the Russian corridor. So when the Russian corridor was impacted negatively through their own acts of aggression towards Ukraine, you could see that the middle corridor of Turkey could basically, for a while, take care of the goal of evading the war zone, which is Ukraine. So yeah, there's also, in terms of green energy, there's good synergy between the countries. There's a green turn, as they say in one report, there's a green turn in Sino-Turkish relations, and the focus in that kind of cooperation between Turkey and China is hydroelectric power, again, just like Iran, nuclear power, and solar power. So in these three areas, both Turkey and Iran are deepening their relations with China through the BRI. And I will conclude now by talking about how it is basically not, I would say, it's not really helpful or useful to talk about BRI as, perfectly compatible or perfectly incompatible with these green energy needs, because it ultimately depends on the country that BRI is cooperating with. So there are issues such as lack of skilled workforce. So some countries don't have enough engineers. So they have to basically borrow Chinese engineers, which is on the one hand good for solving a situation or a problem, but not good in the long term, because skilled workforce is important. Sometimes there's local corruption, so it's not really the fault of the BRI if the project doesn't work. It's the corruption from the partner country, or sometimes the corruption comes within the project itself. So it ultimately really depends on the specific projects that we talk about. But you could plausibly argue that the BRI, or at least in terms of the Middle Eastern segment or portion of the BRI, one of the important areas that concern the Sustainable Development Goals is basically the economic diversification of these countries and moving beyond fossil fuels. And for that, I would say there's really a lot of potential in the relationship between these countries in the region, such as the 6 GCC countries or Iran or Turkey, and then China on the other hand. Thanks a lot. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to address them later or not.
Thank you, Professor, for your speech and for the valuable comments that you make with really objectivity and academic perspective. This is very nice to understand that until which point the geopolitical and geostrategical issues are important here. And it could give objective perspective to the people that watch this event. So now I will give the floor to the Admiral and Professor Hanayat Colombage from Sri Lanka. Good evening in Colombo, Professor.
Okay, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Of course, I am talking to you from Jakarta. So the time here is 2200 in the night. I will focus very little on the SDG aspect, but I will talk about certain aspects of the BRI. But I will talk more related to the national security or overstretching national security, and how does it, I weave the national security, BRI and SDG in my final conclusion. Now, we heard quite a lot about the SDG 2030, but one thing I have to tell, I have to remind ourselves is that, we are only 7 years away from 2030, and I think it's time that we take stocks, that we evaluate the progress that we have achieved during the last so many years from 2015, and see whether we are on track, or whether we need to change the course, whether we need any alterations and additions. So because it's only 7 years to go, why I say this is I have a feeling some of the targets may be achieved, but some of the targets may not be achieved at this trend. I mean, at the way right now the things are. Now we all agree that the world is a very dynamic place, evolving place. Things change very rapidly. And also, if you look at, I think, the last 5 to 7 years, a lot of new things happen in the world. Some of the things that we did not even anticipate would happen. So basically, we can conclude that nothing is permanent, like the religion teaches us, and the interest of countries differ. The national interest differ from the leader to leader, people to people, and the perception of the political parties as well. And not only that, but also the economic conditions and a myriad of other factors impact on the national interest of a country. Why I mention national interest is because we do see many countries, for them, national interest is not development, because either they are developed or they are given up. But for large number of countries, development is their main national interest. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned that last 7 years or so, so many things happened in the world that we did not really foresee coming. If I start with the ISIS, that is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, it came and it went, but it left a big scar and things are not very settled yet. And there were a large number of regime change efforts. And some of the countries subjected to this regime change are suffering big time now, and they are unstable, and their economies are in a very bad shape. And of course, we all remember the recent 2 events, that is the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Now, these events that I mentioned has changed the dimension the world was going on. And now, of course, we do see slowing down of many economies, and we do see that disruption to global chains and scarcity of food for many people in the world. And also there are a lot of disruption to air travel. And few months ago, we saw the prices of oil going up massively, and there were shortages of oil and gas, and the prices going up, and then shortages of wheat, leading to a food crisis in the world. So also we hear, if you look at the last week or so, a number of banks collapsed, number of leading major banks collapsed. Now, this is a very scary feeling. The economists interpret this as the beginning of an international or a worldwide recession. Now, we will be 3 times hit if that happens, because COVID hit us, Ukraine-Russian conflict hit us, and now the economic recession, if it is going to hit us, I don't know where a small economy like Sri Lanka will go. Now, ladies and gentlemen, again, I would come back to Ukraine-Russian conflict briefly from a national security point of view. Now, the West is providing lethal arms, ammunition, large quantities of weapons, tanks, artillery to the Ukraine to fight. That is, we all know that, right? Now, in my opinion, from what I have studied in conflict resolution, first you have to manage the conflict because there is a conflict. And next, you have to resolve the conflict so that the conflict does not escalate into something bigger. Once you have resolved the conflict, you need to transform that situation into long-lasting peace. But what do we actually see in the Ukraine-Russian conflict? What we see is the West is adding fuel to fire. They just keep on pumping munition so that people will get.
Professor, let's come back to BRI and this sustainable development. We are not talking about the Russian war. Okay,
No. I just want to link this to the national security. That's why I went on that tangent. I am coming back. What I'm trying to say is the national interests of various countries differ, and my point is development should be at the center of everything that most of the countries are so worried about, because the BRI to me is development. So I'm sorry, that is why I wanted to bring this issue, because national security for some is great, but many countries like Sri Lanka, the development matters a lot. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, there are many questions that we can ask from this world. What is happening? Is development a key issue for the developed countries, or they want to overstretch national security, put everything under one blanket and prevent BRI going ahead with the progress? This is the question that I think we need to ask. That is why I really wanted to bring these issues. Now, okay, now I'm coming to the BRI proper. Now, BRI, when it was started or when it was launched in 2013, we all know that, like now, of course, now it's about 151 countries. Now, Sri Lanka became a member of the BRI in 2014. So to me, BRI is a way of developing infrastructure, especially maritime related infrastructure for a developing country like Sri Lanka. And at that time, in the year 2013, there was no other collective development project for the world. There was no other collective development project for the entire world when the BRI was launched. And that is why I guess many countries across the globe joined or bandwagon or came on board a BRI, so that they wanted to progress their countries, they wanted to progress their economies, they wanted to develop their countries through the BRI. And we all know the BRI had a shared vision, a community of shared vision for shared prosperity, we all see. But what do we actually see today? Many countries, many developed countries, they play the national security card and they block the progress of BRI. They block the progress of BRI. Now, few arguments they bring in to prevent the progress of BRI. And number one, of course, is national security. I will talk about that a little later as well. But another very common thing that they talk about is debt trap diplomacy or predator economic policies of China. Now, ladies and gentlemen, and incidentally, Sri Lanka is cited as a classic example of Chinese debt trap diplomacy. But let me tell you figuratively, out of total external debt of Sri Lanka, less than 9% is to China. Out of all total external debt of Sri Lanka, less than 9% we owe to China. So where is the debt trap diplomacy? It is something wrong with Sri Lankan way we have governed our country, way we have handled our economy. That is our problem. Basically, it is not the loans that we have taken, but it is basically selling international sovereign bonds at a shorter maturity rate and with high interest for various needs. Now we are saddled with that. So debt. Now, of course, we are going to the IMF to get an IMF bailout package, and China, Japan, India, and the Paris Club has agreed to undergo debt moratorium, haircut, or debt restructuring, whatever we like to call it. So that is happening. So what I'm trying to say is, one argument the West is always bringing against BRI is that it is leading to debt trap diplomacy or predator economic, which is not the case in Sri Lanka, although Sri Lanka is cited as the perfect example, together with other countries. Even Pakistan is cited as a perfect example through the CPEC. Right now, this is the problem, but many projects taking place in Sri Lanka under the BRI is now functioning, bringing in economic prosperity, bringing in money, bringing in investment to the country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we always hear that BRI is predator economics and they are trying to hamper the sovereignty of other countries, and they are trying to have national security implications of other country. But you know, when you criticize something, you have to come up with an alternative. But where is that alternative for a large number of developing countries, right? But BRI came out with a concept and not only a concept, the financial capacity, financial package to implement that concept. Now, we do hear a few things coming up like Global Gateway from Europe, Global Britain from UK, and some other Bay of Bengal initiative and a host of MCC projects from America. But where is the funding? Any major project, unless you have funding, nothing can happen. So this is the second point that I want to bring. BRI came out or came with a package in the package for economics as well. So therefore, now we heard a lot about SDGs. To me, BRI is complementary to SDG because SDG has 17 sectors, including human rights. BRI is also part of that. If we can develop our economies, if we can uplift the people from poverty, if we can provide them their basic needs, then we are meeting the SDG 2030. This is my argument, right? So therefore, what we need, the world need is a collective response. Individually, it's very difficult for a small country to survive. We need a collective response. We need to build resilience for the smaller economies, and we need to implement certain systems and promote investment. Many countries don't want grants, they don't want loans, they want investment, but the investment is not coming. Making the free markets economy is not happening. True economic globalization is not happening. So then finally, I will come to the overstretching national security. We hear every day the large developed countries always take national security issue. National security, therefore we go and invade Iraq. National security, we go and invade Afghanistan. National security, we want the regime change. So this is happening. So this is, I think, overstretching national security, because we all agree national security is no longer the hard military security. It is comprehensive security. There are so many areas, right? Now, anything can be converted, anything can be perceived, anything can be argued as national security, even technology, right? You will say, oh, this equipment can be used for spicing, therefore we must ban it. This social media platform can be used for propaganda against us, therefore national security implication, therefore we must ban it. So this is what I meant by overstretching national security. So this is not the right thing to do, because not only they are overstretching national security, unfortunately, in the world, we see this argument, you are either with us or against us. You are either with us or against us. Now we are talking about a democracy summit, which is coming very soon. Now, this is again a way of dividing the world into camps, which we don't want. We don't want to belong to any camp. We want basic development. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I'm coming to the end of my time as well. So therefore, I will conclude that we need SDG 2030 is a great concept. We need to achieve them. BRI is also a great concept with financial package, and these two are complementary to each other. So basically, when you talk about human needs, human security, human rights, human development, economies, the BRI can provide the world with that. And therefore, we must not look at BRI with suspicion, but on the contrary, we must look at BRI as complementary to SDG 2030, and then work towards a comprehensive, collective, collaborative effort. The time is running out. We need international synergy. We need cooperation. We need understanding to implement a human development plan like BRI at the global level. So with this, I conclude my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you there, Admiral and Professor. Thank you very much for your intervention. I will give the floor just right now to the Dr. Hassan Dodbut in Pakistan. Good evening, Professor. Professor, I don't know if you listen me, because I can't listen you. maybe we have some technical problems. Maybe on the time that the Professor Dud tried to repair the sound, because
Yeah, I am connected.
Ah,
I am connected.
you're here. Okay,
I am
so
connected. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
I can
All the
listen
way.
you. Thank you very much to be here with us. You have the floor there, Professor.
Okay. Thank you very much. And as a practice, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're speaking. And it was like listening and listening. This is like music to my ears, because for someone who's attached with Belt and Road Initiative, who has attended both the Belt and Road Forum, I worked on Belt and Road projects since it started. I was the head of CPEC projects for 6 years, and followed by the SCZ development projects in Pakistan. So I can enthusiastically speak about BRI for hours and hours. So therefore, because of the paucity of time and because of the restriction of the topic, I'll keep myself to a formal speech, because I think in terms of the sustainable development, in terms of the impact that BRI has created in my country and across the region that I go and visit as a practitioner of BRI, and also someone who's done research on that. I think I can highlight some of the tangible outcomes also. But ladies and gentlemen, no year has commenced with such challenges as 2023. With multiple shocks, including the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the food shortages, and the economic distress in large numbers of countries are causing uncertainties and economic challenges, with chances of a possible major recession occurring sooner or later. In this fractioned environment, global businesses and investment are impacted increasingly by oppositional forces. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we see a lot of headwind and a lot of talk around globalization. And I think globalization has never come under stress as much as it's happening now. Despite the fact that the Declaration on the Right to Development was passed in 1986, the development with shared prosperity has not reached the desired attention at the greatest challenge of our time is that despite so many commitments and technology advancement, a sizable population is not even on the development path and is caught up in a poverty trap. And if this does not frighten us, nothing else will. To address the headwinds of the complex structure and broad scope of the Sustainable Development Goals, an integrated and synergetic approach needs to be undertaken by introducing a development system suiting local cultures and environment that allow developing countries to stand up to economic challenges. Regional integration, competitive ability in a global environment, and to sustain region-wide economic growth with an integrated market for the free flow of trade and investment across the region, as the goals are to be achieved by 2030. And just imagine 2030, how far is 2030? And 10 years. I can still vividly remember in 2013, the first time we spoke about, I was in China, we spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative. And then in 2017, how we tailored the policies into in the first BRI forum, followed by the second one. So 2030 is as close as anything. Therefore, this requires using our imagination and a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. And that is urgently needed to shift the world into a sustainable and resilient path, for which out-of-box thinking has to be made to see how extreme poverty is addressed under the agenda of SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are meeting at a time of immense challenge to sustainable development and enormous disparities of opportunities, wealth, and power, natural resources depletion, and adverse impact of environment degradation, including land degradation, freshwater scarcity, and loss of biodiversity, exacerbated the list of challenges that we living on this planet have. The beginning of this year has also seen a surge in deadly terrorist incidents and growing political instability, for which the Admiral also referred to. posing daunting challenges to the overall development, achieving the targets of SDGs. As we embark on this collective journey, and this webinar is perhaps a stepping stone towards that, 2023 marks the 10th anniversary of the One Belt, One Road and the BRI, as we call it now. And the implementation of all the targets that were set in all the BRI forums, and including the discussions and the MOUs that were signed later, and within and as the partner countries increased. I still remember our first meeting happening on BRI and me presenting the case in the first BRI forum. The implementation of which has greatly promoted the right to development of various participating countries of BRI. The Chinese government, under the leadership of President Xi, continues to promote the conditions and initiatives, of course, like the Belt and Road, but I'm so happy as I study the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative and the formulative actions plan that have been set, and major policies based on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era under the vision of shared prosperity. And this is so good to see, linking environment degradation to security and to poverty alleviation, and how this can address, including the challenges. And for a country like Pakistan, which is combating terrorism at one stage and also looking at the devastation of the floods, we see BRI really as a beacon of hope. In the past decade, ladies and gentlemen, the Belt and Road Initiative has galvanized nearly $1 trillion, launched over 3,000 cooperation projects, created over 400,000 jobs, and lifted 40 million people out of poverty. And of course, China is now exploring and focusing on sectors and expanding investment with an increased focus on improving governance, addressing climate change, and of course, the linkages between the GDI, GSI, and of course, BRI. Improving education through R&D and connectivity of policies for seamless trade. Over the past 10 years, the Belt and Road Initiative has responded to the historical trend of economic globalization and the requirement of the times of change in the global governance system, and has remained resilient and vigorous, continuing to provide new opportunities for participating countries like Pakistan, and promoting and enhancing their development as one of the core aspects of their human rights. BRI is viewed, as I said, as a beacon of hope. But ladies and gentlemen, each country faces specific challenge in its pursuit of sustainable development. As a country in transition, Pakistan is looking to further strengthen the economic ties between the two countries, China and Pakistan, and looks for Chinese FDIs and industrial support for a path of stability. In Pakistan, and you can take these numbers because you hear so many things around the debt trap and around the socio-economic impact that BRI promised and whether it has delivered. In Pakistan, the CPEC initiative has created over 100,000 jobs for employment, opportunities for employment. 6,000 megawatt of electricity and over 510 kilometers of road, creating the rural-urban synergy and regional connectivity through Gwadar Port, and of course, the coastal highway. It has actually helped us develop challenges from human development to sustainability challenges, and this momentum is supporting Pakistan to explore new avenues of cooperation for further growth and for combating challenges like poverty and unemployment. I can give you direct numbers that one road that was built between a rural center and an urban center has created investment opportunities of over 2 billion in just last 1 year, where we had COVID also. And of course, our rural-urban synergy on the Western corridor linking all the way to Afghanistan has actually helped us combat terrorism. But ladies and gentlemen, as we move forward on the development path, we might expect even broader discursive changes, more challenges, and wider transformation in the way political actors understand the challenges ahead. With global leadership, while the global leadership remains focus on leaving no one behind, and President Xi Jinping in his remarks on the 14th National Congress stated that a people-centric development philosophy must be implemented so that the gains of modernization will benefit all fairly. And while all this echoes well with the SDGs vision, which in turn require a policy dialogue. Conversely, the political discussion that we are seeing today is perhaps creating some challenges and headwinds. And perhaps also some of the discussion targeted against certain nations and their development in events like the Democracy Summit, when one of the speakers spoke about, may create bilateral biases that can have a negative impact on the visions to build strong economic foundations for which sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth is essential. To end, ladies and gentlemen, in these challenging times, governments have a critical role to play in identifying and financing high-priority initiatives through an integrated and synergized approach towards capacity building. Because in Pakistan, we need support through BRI for building our capacity. We need more infrastructure development. We need optical fiber so that we can be the part of the seamless trade that BRI promises. And also manage the progress in achieving sustainable development goals and the overarching 2030 agenda. To achieve all this, it is expected that leadership at all levels should be bold, flexible, and help countries like Pakistan to achieve the path of prosperity and mutual growth. If you look at all the deliverables that were set in the BRI forums and all the discussions, because I vividly remember the head of IMF present in the first BRI forum and spoke about how BRI supports the economic agenda that IMF has, and of course the World Bank has. In Pakistan, I have seen and have worked at a leadership level on CPEC projects, and I see the rural-urban synergy. I also, through this, want to thank the Chinese government, because through BRI, we got a grant of $1 billion for socio-economic development projects for agriculture, for healthcare, for education, and in that, virtual education was so important. And if this does not suits the SDG, what will? So let's forget our biases and move towards a better world where initiatives like BRI, initiatives under the platform of GDI, GSI, SEO, and the other, which promises prosperity, should be supported. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for your intervention. Really important. And we know that Pakistan is part of this group, so it's really important to have a perspective from you. And really, again, thank you. So I will give the floor just right now to the Dr. Eric Solheim. Good afternoon from Geneva there, Doctor.
Good afternoon, Geneva. I would say good evening to all the Asian participants. It's quite late already in parts of Asia, but so happy to join this meeting. And let me start by celebrating something very positive which happened last weekend, where China played a key role. And that was bringing together Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two arch enemies of the Middle East, one the proponent of Sunni Islam, the other the proponent of Shia Islam, two nations which had been into a number of shady wars in the Middle East over the last decades. It's not like all this will disappear just by the Chinese initiative, but it's likely to have very positive impact on Yemen, Syria, and a number of other conflicts in the Middle East, and for sure bringing together these two giants, economic and political giants in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia. We should celebrate the good news because, yes, as Professor Butt and Admiral Columberch hinted to, there are also bad news, but this is really good news. And it's a triumph for Chinese diplomacy. And coming from the West, I may identify a couple of reasons why China was able to do this. China has stayed out of every war since 1979, while we in the West has basically been involved in every war since 1979. And China has taken the view that when there is a conflict, it will try to keep a link to both parties to the conflict and find solutions, and not pushing weapons or simple political solutions. And added, China had been able to be close to both Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's not an easy task, but it's very, very important if we want to solve conflicts. I really pay tribute to this diplomatic initiative of China. But I think it speaks loudly about the world which we are entering into, because for all practical reasons, this is the Asian century. If we go back to 1750, the economy of China was about maybe 2%, it was about 30% of the world, and of India maybe 25%. Then at the independence in 1949, they were down to 2 or 3% each. So it was from being the giants of global economy to basically being reduced to nothing. Because the same was the case with what is today Pakistan and many other parts of Asia. But since then, there's been just progress. At an independence, China and India life expectancy was 30 years, even probably a little bit below 30 years. Now life expectancy in India is 68, in China is 78, and life expectancy in China this year passed life expectancy in the United States of America. What an achievement in 75 years' time. Enormous achievements. At independence, very few Chinese and hardly any Indians could read and write. Now, of course, every single child in China is in school, and nearly all children in India also starting in school, even if in some places, of course, education is not of the quality which we wish to have. So there is fantastic progress, and when we can celebrate progress in the world, it's largely due to Asia, because Asia was seen as a continent of poverty in the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s. There were UN conferences saying that Asia can never feed itself. This is the continent of poverty. This is the place which can never, ever succeed. And then Asians proved exactly the opposite. And now it's thanks to economic growth in Asia that the world economy overall is improving. And thanks to Asia that overall, while we're not fully successful, overall there is progress on basically all sustainable development goals. And look to my core area, Asia is now leading the charge for sustainability for the environment. On every technology we can think of, which is green, China is the world leader. 82% of all solar panels in the world last year were made in China. 70% of all electric batteries were made in China, and most of the rest in South Korea, by the way. 57% of all electric cars in the world were sold in one country alone, that is China. So whatever you think of green hydrogen, solar, wind, high-speed rail, China is the world leader of green technologies. But India is soon moving into a second position. In a couple of years, India for sure will be the second biggest solar power in the world, next to China. And Prime Minister Modi is launching any number of green initiatives, basically by the day. It's called green missions, that is using the state to promote green development, very much in the same way as South Korea did in the past with enormous success. So there's a lot of progress to celebrate, and Belt and Road is one part of that. Admiral Columbage and Professor Butt has set out a number of the progress which has happened in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, thanks to Belt and Road. I mean, I was just in Colombo, and the roads are frankly much better than they were a few years ago. And it's to a large extent thanks to China. Of course, Sri Lankans have made this road, but China's provided technology and knowledge and for sure money for this to happen. And it takes maybe half an hour from the airport to Colombo now, and it will take maybe 1.5 hours in the past with heavy traffic in narrow roads. So this is great progress. But go around, Laos, landlocked country in Asia, now linked to the entire global system for transport of goods through the Yunnan Laos Railroad, which link it to the Eurasian rail link. Hanoi Metro, Bandung to Jakarta Railroad, Trans-Malaysia Railroad, Trans-Thailand Railroad, of course, massive railroads in Kenya, in Ethiopia, There are so many testimonies to the importance of Belt and Road to improve the lives of people. And of course, it's not just infrastructure, not just transport, it's education, it's health, it's people-to-people contacts. There are so many dimensions which Belt and Road has helped developing nations. And that's why nearly all developing nations in the entire world, whether you speak of Latin America or Africa or Asia, they're all part of Belt and Road. The one big exception is India for geopolitical reasons, which you can all understand, but basically every other developing nation is part of Belt and Road, and they are completely voluntary parts of Belt and Road. They do it because they believe it benefits their nation. Some people are speculating why China has launched this 10-year-old initiative, which was launched in Kazakhstan 10 years ago by President Xi Jinping. I see 3 reasons for that, and I believe these 3 reasons are exactly the same as when the United States were providing the so-called Marshall help to Europe after the Second World War. And they're all 3 acceptable and understandable. One is a simple wish to help. You want to help nations which have not been so successful as China. I mean, China has grown at a speed, at a scale as no other nation in human history, and they want to help nations which have not achieved that by providing investment, sharing experience, and many other ways. Second is, of course, an enlightened view on the economy. If Chinese business shall thrive, shall provide jobs in China, we shall bring all in China up into the middle class, well, it needs to be internationalized. It needs to work with other parts of the world to share experience, to export products, to import raw materials, whatever it may be. And no economy can really succeed by its own. So it's an enlightened view of the economy. And thirdly, yes, China wants to be seen in a good light. But is that just China? When the United States or Germany or Japan, whatever nation is providing development aid, because they want to be seen in a good light. That's one reason why they do it. Nothing wrong with that. Every nation wants to influence others, at least to show respect to themselves for this. So this as a wish to help, enlightened view of the economy, and yes, power assumption that you will, if you help others, you will get in a good light, and it will help you in any other area. These are the 3 reasons why China is doing it, and we should respect them all. And they're exactly similar to what have been the reason for the United States when they have been on their best. Then there are criticisms to Belt and Road, and let me mention 3 of them. Admiral Colomard spoke about the so-called debt trap. I mean, that is pure and simple anti-Chinese propaganda, nothing less. Sri Lanka, which I know very well, Admiral Colomard said it, 9% of the debt is to China. The rest is to India, to the International Monetary Fund, to Japan, to Western donors, to many others. Why then single out China as the main problem? What Sri Lanka needs is exactly what President Wickremesinghe is now doing, an agreement with China, and President Xi has said that he will play ball with Prime Minister Modi of India, with the International Monetary Fund, with everyone to work in concert to help Sri Lanka. And I'm very sure that President Wickremesinghe will achieve that in the very near future, and on that basis gradually bringing Sri Lanka up from the current difficult economic circumstances. But there's no difference. I mean, yes, China has helped developing the port of Colombo or the building roads. Other nations have also invested, and there need to be a solution to the debt. But why use this as a propaganda tool against China? And the same is the case everywhere else. To the country, it's probably much more easy to get a debt relief from China than from some of the multilateral institutions, which are very bureaucratic and tend to be difficult to negotiate with. Second criticism is that Belt and Road is about Chinese power. And as I said, yes, it's about Chinese power, because if you help others, you will get into a better relationship with them, which will help you overall. But that's no reason to speculate about that. It's completely normal. The third criticism, which was true in the past, but is no longer true, is that Belt and Road was far too brown, meaning not environment friendly. The number of investments which can be criticized from an environment point of view was a lot of coal, a lot of oil and gas. But after President Xi 1.5 years ago said that China will stop all overseas coal investment, And that happened at exactly the same time as nations like Kenya and Bangladesh and many others also wanted to get out of coal. We see a drastic slowdown in coal and a full stop in coal. And of course, we will then see massive investment in solar and wind and green hydrogen and all the great green technologies that China is the world leader, and also have the financial resources to invest. So what was a somewhat brown initiative is now one of the greenest initiatives in the world. This has created some concerns in the West. My view is very simple. If there is some criticisms to China in the West should simply do better. I'm not aware of any developing nation which want to be only with the United States or only with China. Everyone wants to be friendly both with the United States and China. The case point here, I mean, Pakistan or Sri Lanka is very clear. I mean, none of these nations just want to be only with China. They want also to be with China, but of course also a good relationship to the West, to Japan, to Korea, to many other potential investors. So there's no reason to be skeptical. And so far, the Western kind of counter initiatives have been a lot of talk and not so much action. You may recall at the G7 meeting in the United Kingdom 2 years ago, it was launched a Western counter initiative to Belt and Road. So far as I have registered, no secretariat, no money, no budget, no program, no nothing. Just frankly, a media opportunity and nothing more. And people look through this, and we cannot fool the world. People look through this. So what Western nations should do is to raise similar amounts of capital for developing the world, for investment. And we should look into much more how we can be complementary to each other rather than competitive. In some areas, China has experience which the West don't have. And China is producing 82% of the solar panels in the world. It's probably very realistic that China is the best help when it comes to invest in solar. When China has produced 70% of all high-speed rail in the world in the last decades, while the United States has produced absolutely zero, not 1 kilometer high-speed rail, it's much more likely that China has the experience, the knowledge, the technology, the people to make investments in high-speed rail than the United States, which has none of this domestically. So let China focus when they are at the best. There are some areas where the United States can compete. Still, the American universities are seen as the best in the world. Inviting students from Africa or developing countries to the great American universities is a great service to the world because they get knowledge which are very much asked for in basically all developing countries. Health is an area where the United States, we say Bill Gates and others have done a lot of service to the world. But we should look into how the West and China could be complementary rather than this zero-sum game of competition. Yes, there is business competition, that's sound, but let's look into how we can work together. Finally, whatever is the issue of our time, we need to work together. Whether it's development, poverty, peace, terrorism, we need to work together. Look to how much more difficult it would have been to defeat the ISIS terrorist group if the different powers have worked counter purpose to each other. Maybe some had even supported the terrorists. That was the case during the Cold War, where the Americans basically supported any anti-Soviet group anywhere in the world, and the Soviet Union supported any anti-American group in the world, and it made it much, much more difficult. So we need to work together. The biggest obstacle to working together today is the Western idea that when you modernize, you also need to Westernize. Look, I mean, from the very first non-Western nations which developed, and that was Japan, that was the core issue for them. How could they modernize Japan while still being Japan and true to the historical culture and not Westernize? And same with Korea later, but Japan is very much Japanese today. Korea is very much Korean. China is very much Chinese. I mean, the Chinese governing system, in my view, is basically a reflection of 2,500 years of history. Sometimes it's called communist. It's much more Confucian. It's a system which was developed at the very latest in 2200 before Christ, when the Han Dynasty came into power, first the Qin and then the Han Dynasty came into power in China, and it's reflecting of the collective memory of the Chinese people throughout this history. The beauty of that is there's not one Chinese, I've never ever met a Chinese who thought that that system could be exported somewhere else, that Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Norway or the United States could adopt their governing system. They understand this is a Chinese system that serves China well, but it's not for export. We need to take a lot more of the same approach in the West. Frankly, the American political system has served America well. It's one of the most developed nations in the world, and while there have been some problems in the last decade for sure, overall, the United States have been able to bring great presidents at the most difficult times of their history, like Lincoln or Roosevelt or Washington. So the democratic system has served the United States very well. There is no reason why we cannot coexist. We should give up the idea that others should adopt a Western system. And of course, the Chinese, as I said, will never expect their system to be exported. Prime Minister Modi, in my view, is doing exactly that in India now. He's basing his rule on the historical culture roots of India linked to Hinduism, and in that sense, making India more Indian and more true to the real roots of Indian history. But this is happening everywhere. President Erdogan is Turkey is doing a lot of the same. We see nations understand that we can modernize, we can bring enormous prosperity, while at the same time being true to our roots and not adopt other systems. And the West need to get out of its missionary instinct that the entire world should accept every idea, I mean, when I read, and I read a lot of articles from the foreign policy establishment in Washington, and nearly every time there is the idea that America should intervene in some form whenever there is a problem in the world. Well, that time has gone. The world will not accept it. And it's not right either, because the competence is not just in Washington, it's competence in every capital and every corner of the world. And we need to find a way to work together. And there's no reason whatsoever that we cannot coexist, cooperate on all joint issues, getting out of COVID, improving the world economy, solving climate change, defeating terrorism, finding solutions to the war in Ukraine. All this we need joint efforts. Then we need to work together, even if systems are different. It's a great saying in the old Vedas of India. It says, the entire universe is one family. That is the approach we need to take in the 21st century also. We are in it together. Together we can resolve problems. Separated and in conflict, it will be much, much more difficult. So the whole universe is one family. Thank you so much. Xie xie in Chinese.
Thank you very much there, Doctor. You give some numbers, and you was very objective, you know, with all the issues that you mentioned about the BRI and SDGs, and I think this is important to mention that in events like this one. So we search evidently with event like this one to be really objective, and really thank you, because you was really professional, and it's important to know that from you. So actually I will give the floor to Gustavo in Argentina. He mentioned just before that he has some problems. I don't know if he's connected, so I don't know if he can listen me.
I can listen to you. I think I'm connected. I don't know if you're reaching me okay.
Perfect. Muchas gracias, Gustavo. Buenos días en Argentina.
Buenos días. Okay. Buenos días. Good morning and good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been strong feeling that a new world is being born, right? We will surpass this world as it has been up to now, a world of massive wars and inequity. And China is leading the new world. It's the first one, right? We hope it will be that is a democratic world in which no country will rule over the others, right? And many countries now are suffering what China suffered for many times. That is the domination of global powers and the fact that China has liberated completely and from then developed the way it did. It shows a way to the rest of the country, not only inspiring but showing a way. So we hope China is the first country of a new movement, not only China, as I said, but all of our countries. There is a hard way to go. We will need to work hardly to fulfill the commitment of a new world order. And one of the fields of such fields is communications. And I think that is why I am invited here. Um, there are almost no means of communication created already among all our countries. I mean, there's no bridges of there are very few bridges of communications built between Asia and Latin America. And maybe if we take as a whole the Central Asian countries, Arabian countries, African countries, Latin America and Asia.
Yes, so we see that the Gustavo has some problems in
I
Buenos
don't know if
Aires.
I'm back.
Oh, he's come back, but we can't see you. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. We have some problems of electricity because we have it's very hot in Buenos Aires. And okay, as I was saying, if we take the main areas of our countries like Central Asia, among our countries. So we need to communicate, to understand each other, and we need to understand each other to work united. This webinar is a contribution to such work, so that I congratulate this bridge and all the people that have been working very hardly on this on organizing this event. Here in Argentina, I established a magazine, a media for the communication between Argentina and China 12 years ago, and but it's a very singular. I mean, there are no other media created in such sense. So we need many of them. We need many of them. Argentinians want to know about China, and all the news they get is from the propaganda from the United States and other superpower, which is not information about China, right? And the Chinese media do not reach our people. So we need to create means to be communicated. Nowadays, we are trying to build up a network of journalists of all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. You know, it's just very slow work. We have to make it, you know, bridge by brick. It's very difficult because it's not created. I mean, we have to build it from the bottom, and but we think that is the way. So this is to show I'm very thankful for this seminar, and this is an invitation to pay attention to the possibility of creating communication bridges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Gustavo. Muchas gracias. Before to make a personal question that I would maybe ask to the colleagues that are here, we have one question that was right for the Professor Solheim. So you mentioned that BRI contribute to enhancement of human rights and overstretching of national security. Too much resources is devoted to security, but also there will be a World Democracy Summit or too much results also pour it into democracy. Professor, maybe could you answer that?
Yeah, look, in the middle part of the 20th century, East Asia was the scene of most wars. I mean, more than 80% of all who died in conflicts in the world died in East Asia, in Korea and in Vietnam and many other places. In the early 1980s, the great Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, but also many other East Asian leaders, whether in Korea or in Singapore and many others, that decided we will prioritize economy. We will not prioritize military, we prioritize economy. And they prioritized the economy over military, and that's why also China stayed out of every war since the war with Vietnam in 1979. This has for sure served China extremely well. China has a much lower percentage of its state budget in the military than the United States, much lower part of its GDP in the military than the United States, simply because it prioritized economic development above everything else. And the result has been that now East Asia is the most peaceful part of the world. There's not one military conflict of any significance in East Asia. There are conflicts in Africa, there are some in Latin America, in other parts of Asia, but not in East Asia. And that is because of this attitude. We will give priority to peace and we'll give priority to economic uplifting of our people, which also has succeeded fantastically. There is no mirror image between China and the United States. I mean, the United States ask or demand the right to be able to send their military forces exactly to the border to China. They demand to send their Air Force carrier to the Chinese sea border. There's no Chinese carriers in the Caribbean or up to the closer coast of California or at the Bahamas or Barbados. I mean, you will never see a Chinese carrier there. If one had to come, there would be a revolution in Washington. There would be a panic if the Chinese were to send military forces that close to China. That close to the United States, as the United States demand to do versus China. So we should learn from this priority of peace. I mean, China can do better in some areas. They can find ways of resolving or reducing the dispute with India in the Himalayas. They have some unresolved dispute with some Southeast Asian nations on some of the islands there. And China, in my view, should take a low profile in these issues because that will give more leverage to China. But overall, China has been an enormous force for good and for peace. In the Security Council of the UN, the one nation which is using the veto power the least, again, is China. It's not the Western powers, not for sure not Russia, but it's China. So let us give credit to this policy of peace, and let's take more of it. When it comes to human rights, yes, there are some areas where West has a lead compared to China on human rights. I mean, the ability to speak exactly your view on every issue is more developed in the West. But if you take the human rights as a whole, please read the Human Rights Declaration of the UN. It's a fantastic document. It starts with the right to live, the right to existence, the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, the right to pray to whatever God you want to pray to. All this is part of the Human Rights Declaration. And for nearly all these rights, there have been enormous progress in China. And China has a lot to discuss with the world and to teach the world. And we cannot have this very, very narrow view of human rights. That is just a few areas where, yes, the West may be ahead of China.
Okay, thank you there, doctor. So the same question was made for the Admiral Colombage, and he answered that so what I mean is BRI contributes to promote human rights with development prospect and bringing people out of poverty and providing them with better opportunities. Overstretching national security is by those who are against BRI, as they put every aspect into national security to block the progress of BRI and China. Yes, democracy summit will divide people more. We don't need a summit of this nature when the world is engulfed with many burning issues. Resources should be provided to alleviate suffering of people rather than having a major summit to divide people. This is the answer of the Professor Colombage. And maybe Professor Solheim, I have maybe a second question for you that was made too by the people that watch us just right now. I thought, as you say, China is not involved in any of those armed conflicts. Still, it has always been criticized, for instance, in terms of human rights. They will be surely once again to be targeted for this Mount World Democracy Summit. How do you comment that?
I am not sure that these democracy summits are very helpful, because they create a very artificial dividing line between so-called democracies and more authoritarian structures. Singapore is one of the most successful nations in the world. Basically, every individual on the entire planet would love to live in Singapore if they could. Well, Singapore is not invited to this conference because it's not seen as a perfect democracy. Africa, there is not one democracy in Africa where the dividing line is ideology or left or right politics, anything like that. In basically every nation in Africa, even if it's a democracy, the dividing line is ethnicity. It's tribe, it's religion, it's geography, but it's ethnicity. In some nations, I lived in Kenya, 99.99% of the people voted for one leader, and if you were Kikuyu, 99% voted for one. If you were Luo, the other main tribe in Kenya, 99% voted for the other. So it's a fully tribal or ethnic or religious context, not an ideological. So it's not obvious that the democratic system as it developed in the United States is very suitable for these circumstances. And take the war in Ukraine. The United States has tried to put that as a war between autocracy and democracy. This struggles in two main dimensions. One is that, of course, Ukraine before the war was no democracy. Ukraine was one of the most failed states in the world. Out of the 16 post-Soviet nations, Ukraine was probably the least successful. Kazakhstan, which had a more authoritarian system, well, in 1989, Ukraine and Kazakhstan was at the same level. 30 years later, Kazakhstan was 3 times richer per capita than Ukraine. And everyone who visited Kazakhstan versus Ukraine could see how much better the living conditions were in Kazakhstan versus Ukraine. So Ukraine was not a democracy, which is important to defend before the war. And secondly, if you make it an issue of autocracy versus democracy, you divide the world. When President Biden went to Saudi Arabia and tried to mobilize Saudi Arabia to stand up for democracy in Ukraine, because it was a complete non-starter. Saudi Arabia will not do that. But even big developing nations' democracy, like in India, Indonesia, or Brazil, which are the 3 out of the 4 biggest democracies in the world with the United States, none of these nations want to defend democracy in Ukraine. What they want to defend is sovereignty in Ukraine. All these nations believe it's a very bad idea that Russia can grab a part of another nation and include it into its own landmass. Because if you accept that the national sovereignty shall not be defended, there is no limit. There's no nation in Africa where not another nation can make a claim to your sovereignty, and even in large part of Asia, there's any number of overlapping claims for sovereignty. So if you don't accept national sovereignty as a non-starter, you do not attack the national sovereignty of another nation, we will have any number of wars. So as far as I can see, every nation in the world, China, India, Pakistan, whatever nation, are ready to support the national defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine. And that should be the core issue of the war. If you make it democracy versus autocracy, you simply divide the world. There's much less support for Ukraine than it could have been. And you make it a dividing line rather than bringing everyone together. Look to how George Bush Sr. during the first Iraq war over Kuwait in 1990, he brought the entire world together behind the Americans in the defense of the sovereignty of the state of Kuwait. That's the same approach we should take now to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, rather than to be divided in between more or less democratic nations.
Great. Really very much for your answer. For us as organizations, it's important that this event goes beyond the political rhetoric and that each of the intervention of the panelists can contribute to the good development of the SDGs goals, which regardless of the criticism that may be made, represent an ambitious agenda for a better world. For this reason, I would tell again, thousand thanks to all those who followed us in this event. Thanks to the panelists, to the permanent missions that maybe tried to follow us on the YouTube live streaming, but for the technical problems and internet problems, the streaming was not constant, but we recorded the event, so we will put that after on the YouTube channel, and the people could follow after the side event. And again, thank you very much for the objectivity, for the professionality. Thank you to Ko, who I will leave maybe the little minutes to maybe mention something, because he was co-organizer of this event, and without him we couldn't make this event. Ko, I don't know if you want to mention something before closing this event. I don't know, Ko, could you listen?
Yeah, I have nothing much to say except to thank all the the speakers. It's very late in this part of the world. It's midnight now. Yeah. So yeah, as you said, peace is the prerequisite for all development. Whatever is BRI, whether it's BRI or Sustainable Development Agenda, without peace, everything is gone. So it's very important. We all treasure peace, and then we hope that whatever conflict will end soon. And we hope that China, being China's rise is peaceful rise. As you say, China has never fired a bullet anywhere in the world. And I hope you can play a more more leadership role, as what he has done in the recent Iran Saudi detente, you see. So let's hope this will be more peaceful in future. Thank you.
Thank you too. Thank you very much for your words. So thank you again to everybody. I wish all of you in Latin America a nice day, good evening in Asia, good afternoon here in Europe. My name is David Lopez, representative of the International Association of Human Rights and Social Development in Switzerland. I hope meet you soon and take care of you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you very much. So I made sorry to so we are out of the